this morning is Wendy Bunston. Wendy is a senior clinical social worker with a Master's in Family Therapy and further postgraduate work, or I should say further postgraduate qualifications in organisational dynamics and infant mental health. She has worked as a social worker for 24 years and over 14 years as a manager within Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital Integrated Mental Health Program. And she's set up multi-award-winning programs addressing family violence and a community group program, and she's published extensively in the areas of childhood trauma, child-adolescent health sex offending, family violence and group work. And Wendy has developed specialist group work programs for children and their parents affected by family violence called PARCAS. I hope I got that right. Wendy, I no doubt we'll hear something about that. As well as the Peekaboo Club for infants and mothers, and more recently, Dads on Board for men who have successfully completed a men's behaviour change program and for their infants. So please welcome Wendy Bunston.
Okay, let me talk loud, because I'm pretty good at talking loud. Can you hear me if I talk loud? Sorry? But can you hear me if I talk loud? Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk loud until we get help. All right. And it's probably a really lovely segue into what I wanted to start this talk about. It's going to be something slightly different, I guess, to the other presenters in that I want to talk about more of the micro level. So I want to talk about you guys as opposed to the broader system issues. But Elizabeth said something very profound. Elizabeth, you were very profound this morning. She can't hear me. It's really going well so far, this talk. And this is as a good citizen too, for those of you that didn't hear this notice at the beginning, if there is an emergency, where to go, okay? So that's that health and safety sort of stuff, and where do you go in a fire, in an emergency, all that sort of business. So just to let you know, you go somewhere over there or somewhere over there, okay? But that comment really resonated with me in relation to what I want to talk to you about today, because I want to talk about what children and infants have taught me about this work in relation to family violence, and I'll talk to this little pamphlet board towards the end. But I want to talk about that statement in relation to if there is an emergency, where to go for infants and children that live with family violence. And thinking about, for the traumatised infant and toddler, whose mother is perhaps dissociating because of the trauma that's happening to her, and or if there's reciprocal violence between the husband and wife, and or if it happens to be the wife that's violent to the husband, so I'm taking in all configurations here, what happens to that infant in an emergency and where do they go? Does anyone have an answer? Under the bed. Under the bed? So if they're a 6-month-old, where do they go? In their head? Yep. And what happens when a 6-month-old goes into their head? Yep. So 6-month-olds aren't built or meant to go into their head. They're meant to actually call upon their caregiving environment to say, hey, this is a bit big for me. I need you to come in and I need you to help me manage this. Or not at 6 months, probably manage it, please. Can you sort this out for me? This is really noisy. I don't like it. Sort it out for me. But we're talking about kids. So the slice of work that I'm talking about is to do with children that come from backgrounds where they are constantly exposed to ongoing and significant family violence and what that means for them. So I wanted this talk to very much, I think, appreciate the complexities of this work. And we had the Three Musketeers from Nest who spoke yesterday. Are they here today? Oh, Okay, I was going to say really lovely things, but if you're not here, I'm not going to. But they were talking about their early childhood development work with families at risk and talking about the neurological information and how to apply that. And I want to do that as well today, but I also want to do it from the context of what have infants taught me, Wendy Bunston, and what do infants teach us all the time about their world, but perhaps we're so adult-centric that we don't see it. So I'd like to talk about that, what they've taught me and how it applies to the practice. This is really complex work. It's complex being a worker in this field. It's complex knowing what to do in this field. So I don't want to underestimate at any level how complex the nature of this work is. And I guess I thought it would be useful to start with something that was very sobering that occurred in Melbourne recently. Am I allowed to say Melbourne? Someone said don't mention the mainland. Don't mention the mainland! Okay. So Jill Mayer, I'm not sure if it had the same reverberations through the state of Victoria as it did in Melbourne, but this had a huge impact, I think, on the psyche of certainly inner Melbourne and thinking about it could have been me. So I wanted to start with this because I wanted to draw your attention to one thing in particular, and this is in relation to the man who was arrested in relation to the murder and rape of Jill Mayer. And it says here that the 41-year-old had an emotionally and physically abusive childhood and a violent and fractured relationship with his father for many years. And why I've called this talk Working Backwards is I think this is really important things that we need to keep in mind. I don't think this takes away from the enormity of what has been committed, but I think if we lose sight of the fact that there was a history, there was something that happened way back when that has quite potentially contributed to this outcome, then I think it shows us the urgency of this work. That getting in as soon as we possibly can is incredibly important work to do. And it also touches on, I think, the other level of complexity in this work is how do we remain empathic I'm using the word perpetrator because I think we all know what the word perpetrator means but how do we remain empathic in working with men who've been violent and women who've been violent to their children? How do we remain empathic to working with people who can actually help us understand where this comes from in the first place? Now, before I started my work in the area of family violence, I worked with adolescents who committed sex offences, and that's what I did my master's thesis on. And I think one of the profound learnings I learnt from those young men at that time that I interviewed was that these were nice young guys. I really enjoyed talking to these guys. What they did was not nice, certainly, but these were nice kids. And I think it was really important for me to learn about my capacity to remain empathically engaged with these young men in order to actually form a relationship with them where they might be able to empathically engage with themselves and empathically engage with their victims. So I think empathy is a huge part of how we do this work. And if we lose sight of empathy, then I think what we just replicate is quite punitive stances towards things that happen in our society that we just can't tolerate and deal with, but which to some level we may have colluded with because we turn our back on certain things. So I just thought I'd put it out there, say, okay, this is complex stuff. Do you think I've proven my point? Okay. Remember, I'm from the mainland. Okay. All right. So what have children taught me? And what have babies taught me? Well, I wanted for the first 2 or 3 slides to give you a sense, in a summary, of what I think are the main things that I've learned in doing this work. And certainly the first thing I have learned is how do I hear the story of the infants and the children that I'm working with. So when we developed Parkers, which was a program for young children ages 8 to 12 and their mums who'd been affected by family violence, in our very first Parkers group in 1996, so last century, that sounds good, doesn't it? last century, what these kids taught me was that if I was not open to hearing about their complex relationships with their fathers, I would lose them. So instead of coming in and being presumptive in my language, which certainly myself and my colleague were, where we talked about men as the perpetrators and women as the victims, we shut down enormous amounts of conversations with those children because those children loved their dads. Not all of them, but many of those children loved their dads. Some were, I guess, very cross with stepfathers. They were the perpetrators of the violence. But in that very first group that we ran, we certainly learnt very quickly that if we are not making ourselves available to the complexities and the ambivalences that these children hold, we would stop their capacity to engage with us. And I guess at the end of the day, what we're wanting from our relationship with our parents is a capacity, and Steve talked about that yesterday, where he talked about one of the mothers of the two adolescent girls where she told mum everything, and inside mum was thinking, drop the bastard. Sorry for the language, I'm from the mainland. But on the outside she was saying really insightful and open-ended questions to her daughter so that her daughter could come to the same conclusion. But she didn't tell her what she had to do. And I guess what we want in life is that capacity for somebody to feel that we can tolerate all their complexity, all aspects of self. And I think as workers, that's a really vital part of how we provide for the infants, children and families that we work with, that we can hear their stories. And that means taking away some of our blinkers about what we think happens about this work. It means taking away that adult-centric from the top-down approach to, oh, I know what's best for you, and actually enabling children to teach us about what's best for them. And that doesn't mean then that we organise straight away access with someone who's been violent towards them, but it means that we're able to hold the sense of loss and ambivalence they have towards that person. That's incredibly important in this work. And I think if we can hold that without judging these kids or telling them what they should think, we begin to build up a relationship of trust with them. And sometimes they're not going to get that with the other parent, because as soon as they go anywhere near there, they get an avalanche of why that person's a terrible person. And at the end of the day, good enough parenting doesn't mean that you're perfect about the other parent, but it means you can tolerate hearing that your child actually does love that other person, and perhaps might even entertain the idea sometimes of wanting to go and live with them, that you can tolerate that stuff. Incredibly important for children. The other thing that I've learned in this work is to follow their lead. Now, who's a control freak in this room? And honest about it. Why do we do this work? Probably because we think we know best. All right, I had a few interesting looks then. Yes, you do, at many levels, but sometimes kids can tell us some amazing things about where they need work to go. So it's our capacity to be open to the idea of maybe this infant or child can show me where I need to take things next in a therapeutic relationship, in a supportive relationship. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So we had a particular, I'll talk about our Dads on Board group. So we had a group of dads where they'd been through a men's behaviour change program, and we had, in the group, we had two siblings, so a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we had a 6-month-old in the group. And Lily was a 6-month-old, and she was very vocal. So in the group, we had some very interesting times where she would begin to vocalise, and I think that would occur at the time when there was things being discussed in the group that she actually found quite stressful. Now you can say, well, what would a 6-month-old know about the content of language? Neurologically and cognitively, they don't have the capacity to understand language. But they certainly understand the nuance of tone and sound, and when my mum or dad's voice changes. So they can protest at those times and say, I don't like what's happening right now. Now, as a group work facilitator and as a therapist in that group, that's gold. It is absolute gold that I don't think often we think of in relation to having infants in the room. Now, as a family therapist of many years, I used to dread it when people brought babies into sessions. Because I'd think, oh, couldn't you have got childcare? What if they start crying? What am I going to do with this kid? These days it's like, forget the childcare, bring them in. Because I think infants and toddlers give you an enormous amount of information about their emotional world. So they'll let you know when what's happening in the room doesn't feel okay and when it does. They will show you in the room who they feel most comfortable going to and who they don't. So that's stuff that you can use in the here and now to reflect upon and say, I'm wondering what happens when you raise your voice and Samantha moves away from you and sits somewhere else. What do you think's happening for her? What do you think what might she be saying to you? What might be going on for her? Yeah. So it might be that I'm going to go to someone who I think feels safe in this room. And it's amazing how infants can pick out the safe person in a room or the person they feel might be able to be a contingent caregiver. So a backup person that might be able to give them something that they feel their mum can't give them. So there's enormous capacity to invite the voice of the infant and the toddler into the room. And I certainly know that was a big learning for me when we did the mother-baby groups. We'd get to the break, and the very first time we did the group, I had one mum come up to me and literally go, here, I'm going for a fag. And out she went. So here's the baby, and here's me. We're both looking at each other, and it took, I reckon, a good minute, and then it was, Wah! And that was me. That was the child. But that was valuable information for me because I could feed back to Mum, when you were gone, Tony got really distressed. He froze for about a minute, like I did, and then he just protested and said, who the hell are you? I want my mum. Now, for some mums, that's big news because they're not actually used to the idea that my child wants me, needs me, loves me. Big stuff. It's a bit like Dorothy saying the 5-year-old said, I love you, Dorothy Scott, and it should be mum. And I guess that 5-year-old does love mum, but there's lots of baggage that comes with loving mum, like having to be the mum sometimes of mum. So we get an enormous amount of information from kids if we're prepared to let it happen and then to follow their lead about what they need. Now what that little boy told me, because I felt it physiologically, that's right, I wasn't meant to do that, was I? Except it doesn't matter because it doesn't work. What that little boy told me was, I find it very distressing that my mum doesn't keep me in mind, that she goes off and does her stuff and she can't keep in mind that I need her to be around me. And that's information that I could use very effectively and therapeutically with mum. So there's lots of stuff that happens all the time if we're prepared to see it. In terms of following their lead and hearing their story, there's a wonderful mantra that's taken out of infant mental health work which is called Watch, Wait, Wonder. And I think as a family therapist, so some of my work, and I have to fess up that up until, for 16 years I worked at the hospital, and 3.5 weeks ago I stepped into academia and I'm now at La Trobe University. So it'd be interesting in 3 years' time whether I still talk like this or I talk different. I say bigger words and stop swearing, which is something I've needed to learn to do for a long time. But certainly I think it's that situation where now I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Watch, Wait, Wonder, yes. And what's amazing about Watch, Wait, Wonder is in the work that I was doing in our adolescent inpatient unit, It was a very useful thing to do as well when families would come in. So I sort of was like a consultant to that unit, and I would come in and do some family therapy sessions. So the families knew the other workers. And often what I would do is say nothing for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and just watch the dynamic in the room, watch who sat where, and just got a sense of what's the energy in this room. And I think once, if I hadn't done my infant mental health training, where I had to do infant obs and not talk for an hour a week whilst I watched the baby, I probably wouldn't have been able to do that, because I was like, oh, got to get in there, got to show them who I am and tell them who I am and be, so profound. It was like, no, I'll just sit here and see what happens around me. And you get an enormous amount of information about families, particularly in those anxious moments of first coming into a space where they don't know who the hell's who. And there was this one particular family that I did this with, and it was probably 5 minutes, not 10 minutes in, I said, so Mum, could I say something? And everyone looked at me, and I said, so do you know who I am? And they said no. And I said, do you know why I'm sitting here? And they said no. And I said, geez, you're polite. I could be anybody. Do you want to know who I am and what I'm doing here? Yes. And do you want to know what I've observed? And I think that was a very powerful thing for them, because what I observed cut through quite a lot of crap and actually talked about some of the dynamics that were already happening in the family, particularly in relation to who was connected to who and who wasn't connected, and who looked at each other and who didn't look at each other. Really powerful stuff that we have at our disposal if we can manage our anxiety around needing to perform. Understanding their attachment has been critical to this work from my point of view, because I do think attachments are complex for children. And I think they make all sorts of attachments with all sorts of people, and we're part of that community of attachments that they make. And Melanie Klein, who's an object relations therapist, talked about the capacity for reparation. And I think what we're able to do is, if you think of a children's connect the dots pictures, and you get a picture at the end of it. Anyone done connect the dots? Or still do? Come on. When you connect the dots, you begin to see something emerge. And I think we can be the dots, because it might be that you have a 6-week contact with somebody. It might be you have a 6-month contact, a 6-year contact. But I think what we can do for infants and children is give them an internalised experience of a good enough contingent caregiver. See, I could be an academic. So that they can take away an experience, internalise an experience of an appropriately caring and consistent and reliable relationship from an adult. Because what I find in this work most of the time is that children who've come from very damaged backgrounds will not see you as a multidimensional person. They will see you as an adult that represents their experiences of what adults are like. If you've been experienced as a complex, multidimensional person, you can experience other people that way. You can say to yourself, there's layers beneath the layers, and I can think reflectively about what's going on. You can do that because you've had that done for you. If you haven't had that experience where your caregiver has considered you from your point of view and your complexities, it's very difficult to do it to other people. So for a lot of these kids that we work with, it's not about, sorry, what's your name? You shouldn't have sat in the front. I should always warn people. So Kim. It's not about Kim when a child first meets you, we start working with a child. It's about what you represent. So my attachment experience is, Kim, you're going to hurt me. So either I will disconnect from you and make myself so unavailable that you're not going to get anywhere near me, Kim. Sorry to do the face, I'm just being dramatic effect. Yeah, I don't want to traumatise you. But there's a room of people that's going to help you if you are. Or I'm going to attack you before you attack me. Or on the scale of disorganised attachments, Kim, who's Kim? So I don't sit still long enough to actually have a sense of what continuity there could be in a relationship with you and I anyway. Sometimes we can personalise and think, oh, geez, that kid's a shit. I've never had such a shocking child on my caseload or whatever. We have to understand the story behind why would a child need to respond in that way? Why are they so heavily protected of self? Something's happened for them where that's what they've had to do to survive and get through. And I've sort of moved ahead to a slide that I will show you, but for me, it's being able to really respect children's defence mechanisms because they've been there for a damn good reason. And thank goodness they were there. They've become dysfunctional as they move out of situations where they don't need to constantly protect themselves, but that's their default position. To be able to hold their feelings. And that is something that for children who come from backgrounds of family violence have often had their caregiving experience where nobody's held or made congruent their feelings. So they have a false sense of self. So when you've got something traumatic happening at home and you're told, no, nothing happened. So you wake up in the morning and maybe you come out and your mum's got a bruised face and there's a bit of dried blood. And mum says, no, I'm fine, nothing happened. Everything's okay. But you heard bumps in the night and things were going on. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm frightened to go to school today because I don't know if you're going to be okay. Because maybe I can hear, and I don't want to say it's always men that are violent to women. But using that, I guess, which is the common sort of idea that we think around violence, is that if that kid's thinking, I can hear Dad snoring in the bedroom, and he laid on a really big night last night, I don't want to go to school because I'm worried about what's happening at home. If you're told nothing's happening, everything's okay, dismiss it, keep it secretive, then your internal sense of self, your internal gauge about what's okay in the world and isn't okay, is being constantly compromised. Because inside, I'm frightened physiologically, as we're meant to be. Physiologically, my neural pathways are saying, danger, danger, Will Robinson. But, that's for the older people. You young'uns, you missed out. But on the inside, this is horrible. On the outside, no discussion. Nothing's processed, nothing's managed, nothing's regulated. So I begin to distrust what my inside world is telling me. And I become very confused about what happens on the outside to what's happening on the inside. Such that I see perhaps danger at every turn. Because I feel like there's something wrong, but you're saying nothing's wrong. So I go into the classroom where perhaps there is nothing wrong, and I feel like there's something wrong, but you're telling me nothing's wrong. So which reality am I in? Which world am I in here? It's very difficult for kids if you don't have someone who can mirror back to you in a relationship that, yep, you should be frightened at the moment, you should be distressed because something really scary happened. And that's where, again, we can come in, because we can validate children's feelings. Is there a police person today here? There was yesterday? I think the police are in ideal situations to be able to be really congruent to children's experience of violence when they go into domestic violence situations. That rather than dampening it down and saying things like, no, it's all sorted, being able to actually acknowledge to that child then and there that you have just had something really frightening happening. You don't know who I am, so I'm probably really frightening to you too. It's okay for you to feel scared, and it's okay for you to not trust me because you don't know who I am. And you might be worried that I'm going to take away Dad, or you might be worried that I'm going to take away Mum, or you might be worried I'm going to take away you. I don't think that's rocket science. I think that's sort of human decency and sort of civil niceness to be able to recognise when someone's had something scary happening, that you can say you've had something scary happening. And the powerfulness of that ability emotionally to be recognised at that time, neurologically, I think could be quite profound. Have we got any women's refuges staff here? Did I see a little flick? No? Everyone's shy? No? Okay. Basically, I also think women's refuges are... I'm too shy to tell her here, So basically you need to have one of these books before you go, unless you already have one. Yep, so it's good. So essentially, I think in Refuges too, in those first instances where families come in from quite traumatised situations, where infants and children and young people come in, that we can do some incredibly fabulous psychological first aid at that time, because we can acknowledge what it is that they're going through. More than just saying, do you need a cup of tea? Can I help with the washing? Do we need to get schooling? More than that, being able to say, you've just had a terrifying thing happening in your life. How are you? How are you feeling right now? Are you feeling safe here? Is there stuff that we need to do to make you feel safe right now? And being able to say that to not just the mums, but saying it to the children and to the babies. And sometimes we might have highly dysregulated, traumatised, dissociated mums, and it might be appropriate for us to take that baby, because that baby urgently needs a person who's alive and available to them to say it is okay. And we just don't take that baby willy-nilly, but it might be that we've got a mum who's just not there. And maybe it's how we bring that baby back to life and how we introduce ourselves to that baby. Now, another learning in my career was when a colleague came into work. I remember this very clearly. And I just started doing all this work, and they brought their baby in to meet people. Sorry, Kim.
That's all right.
And I'm like, hello, to this baby, who then goes, rah! And it's like I'm thinking, ah, shit, haven't I learned anything yet? Which is like, who says it's okay for me to go into the face of that baby and just go, ah, like that? Because who am I? But we have this tendency sometimes, I think, with babies to think that, oh, they're a baby, we can just do this to them, we can do that to them. I think, are you all right, Kim? I think I've got a Mentos here somewhere. I am never going to sit in the front seat again. But I think it's really okay for us to ask babies, is it okay if I hold you? To introduce ourselves to babies. To actually create a space between us and the baby where we do what it is that we do with everyone else. Like, I wouldn't just go and come up to you and sit on your knee, apart from the fact that I'd probably break them. We're getting really close here, Kim and I. But I wouldn't do that. But sometimes we can just expect babies to do that with us, instead of thinking about their space, particularly traumatised babies, where it's a bit like what we're doing then is treating them as an object as opposed to a subject with their own complex feeling states. So being able to do that in a way where we actually ask permission, is it okay to mum and is it okay to the baby if I hold you at the moment and perhaps help you stop feeling so scared because you're in a safe place now. And how we do that and how we speak will have an enormous potential impact on that baby in the here and now, because babies are incredibly receptive to engaging with others. They're hardwired to connect to others, and they work really hard at doing that. Okay, gee, I crap on. How long have I got? 20 minutes, geez, and first slide. Woo. Okay. It's pretty serious, isn't it? The other thing that I think is really important to this work is the capacity to enable thinking. Now, this does come very much for me, not just from the psychoanalytic literature that talks about mentalisation, which is the capacity to see yourself from the outside in and others from the inside out. I think I got that right. Jeremy Holmes made that quote. And that's basically our capacity to think about the feeling state and the world of the other, and to think about how we come across to others. So reasonably sophisticated interpersonal skills to be able to think, maybe I come across as, and I'm well aware that I come across in quite a daunting way at times, and I can come across as intimidating and all sorts of things. I'm having therapy, so it's okay. But it is the capacity to think about, what impact do I have on others? And be able to think about, I wonder what's going on for them inside. Like I see the outside layer, but What's it like in their world? What's going on for them? And to be able to do that means you have access to higher order thinking. So I don't think I'm going to neurologically be able to go through all this, but I think Brett's going to do that now. Cool. So I won't have to do all that stuff. And I've got overheads that can be scanned and sent out. Is that? Yep. So basically, what I'm trying to say, not very well, is that part of our capacity to be a reflective, thoughtful self comes from our earliest caregiving experiences where someone else has been able to be reflective and thoughtful of us, and that our right brain, which is the emotional side of self, develops in those first couple of years of life, and it's our emotional self that enables us to either consider the world to be physiologically, emotionally and psychologically a safe enough place that we can risk forming relationships with people, or that we go into a shutdown position where the world is an incredibly unsafe place. So we actually stay sometimes fairly much in a lower order brain functioning state, which is really about survival, reactivity. I do what I need to do to get through each day. Our capacity to think in the face of people who find it very difficult to think, and for really good reason, is not to mirror what they're doing. So we can, as workers, become incredibly reactive when we're around people who are very difficult to engage with, who have got constant crises and dramas. So we can mirror what it is that they're doing and be very reactive. It's sort of like, I'm dreading today because at 10 o'clock the Brown family's coming in. I should have had a sickie. We're mirroring probably very much what it is that's going on for them psychologically, which is I can't think about this, I can't bear to think about this because it's too hard and too difficult. So the two of us just come together flapping like seals and really perhaps don't produce much at all. But if we can enable ourselves to stay in a thinking state and think and be curious about, I wonder why it is that I have such a strong reaction to this family. I wonder what's going on there that tells me something about what it might be like to be in their world, takes us to a very different position where we become interested in and curious about the families we're working with as opposed to dreading seeing them. And that takes us to a space where maybe they might begin to mirror us. Neurologically, we have these things called mirror neurons where we do take on the emotional state of others, and we know that scientifically now. So if we can take on what families' emotional states are, they can take on what our emotional states are. And it takes a bit of work to keep ourselves in a thinking state. So this is where I think it's know ourselves. Don't be frightened of our own demons. Don't be frightened of our own hang-ups, our own reasons for why we do this work, or what keeps us here. Know our practice. Be aware of what our strengths are and be able to use those. And I guess the other thing that I'd really like to celebrate is our capacity to bring us into the equation. I think the most treasured thing we bring into relationships is us. It's our capacity for being a congruent human being with another person. It's our capacity to be empathic. It's our capacity to have humour. I think we can make a huge difference to people's lives because we treat people in a way that perhaps they're not used to being treated. So we stand out like a beacon because we're doing it differently. And know our service system. So it's not good enough just to be incredibly profoundly insightful. You also got to know how to do this stuff of connecting, the collaborations, and know the services that are out there. And I challenged a very dear friend who's a psychiatrist once in a big forum that I was presenting at where I'd sort of talked about you need to know about what are the services out there for women that have been affected by family violence. You need to know how to do this stuff. And this psychiatrist in the audience said, but how are we supposed to how are we supposed to know all this stuff? And I said, you get off your bum and you go and you find out. Now, I get on very well with this person. He was able to tolerate me doing that in front of a huge crowd of people. But I actually mean it. Like, none of us are so far removed from this practice that we think other people need to do that work. We all need to take responsibility for knowing how to do this stuff. Why? Because children need us to do this stuff. So as I said, respect defence mechanisms. These defence mechanisms have been there and available to kids to survive horrific situations. So it's not our job to strip these away. It's our job to build a repertoire of other ways of experiencing and other ways of being. There's a really good reason why they're there. And they're a default position, and we all have them. We all have them. And you've got to know how to be playful. In this work, play is seriously important. Playfulness, humour, capacity to move one into a different physiological state by using humour. So when we're sort of auto-regulated to behave in a particular way, humour can be incredibly surprising, but not in a bad way. And it can catch you out in a way where I think you can shift people to a very different position with you very quickly by using humour. And I guess I should have said, and using humility, that when we screw up with families, we say so. I was late this morning because I was busy, whatever. I wasn't concentrating. And I've just sat here and said the wrong thing, or I called you the wrong name, which I've done that before. And I'm really sorry. And can we go back? And is it okay if you start again with me? And is that all right if we, whatever? You say sorry. That's incredibly powerful for many of these families that aren't used to professionals saying, I screwed up. So I won't go through all that stuff because Brett's going to go, woohoo, and do all that. Yay. Yep. But that's a cute picture, isn't it? Yeah. I like the pictures. So how long have I got? 5, 10 minutes? Okay. So what do I want to talk about now? So we know that relationships are incredibly important to brain development. I guess one thing that I think is quite interesting to think about in terms of the neurological aspect, and I'm assuming you won't be talking about Paul McLean's work on...
I'm from Queensland, I'm talking about crocodiles.
See how we just, without even talking about it, it's a bond that's happening. Paul McLean talked about what I think is a really useful way to think about brain development. He's talking about there's 3 layers of the brain. So he talked about that there's the reptilian brain, and it's actually Louis Cozzolino that's got hold of this. It's not like I've found out about him by himself. It was through Louis Cozzolino's work about brains. But essentially, the reptilian brain is the oldest part of the brain. It's the part that's situated in the brainstem and the amygdala, which is our fear centre, and it's very much about survival. And as Steve said yesterday, for those that were here, it was a very powerful way of demonstrating human development. He talked about from here to here, it's really only from that chair that we'd be able to have the social skills to develop civilisations. So for much of our history as human beings, we have been incredibly reactive and very primitive in our response to things because we've had to be, because we've lived in a very hostile and predatory sort of environment. So that capacity physiological to respond and react quickly when we need to has been incredibly important for the human race's survival. And then Steven Spielberg, what's his name? Steven Spielberg? Him. He came in and did the films to show us what happened to the dinosaurs and all the predatory things. So they then went, and I have to confess too, for those who were here yesterday, I do like my TV. I apologise profusely, but I do. I'll take that to therapy too. That essentially, when we didn't have to worry about our survival daily, we then began to build civilization. So we then had the capacity to actually lay roots down, and I don't mean that in a dirty way, but to do that also. So we were interested in reproduction, and we were interested in creating communities at that time. And then in the last few thousands of years, what we have is, oh, there's that quote. Did I get it right? Seeing yourself from the outside. Did I get that right? Anyway, going back to this, that essentially, so Paul McLean talks about the the second layer of the brain that formed at that time in response to our environment, and then the last level of the brain, which is what's developed in the last few thousand years, is the human brain. And that is our capacity to actually be reflective, to have abstract thought and capacity for problem solving. So our capacity to build amazing buildings like this, our capacity to sit in a room and have really sophisticated discussions about ourselves, which is something that we couldn't have done thousands of years ago. But that the reptilian brain is the biggest part of our brain functioning and still has a highly potent and powerful influence on how we operate. And this is what's set up in those first few years of self in our emotional world. And that even though we might go on and do all sorts of profound things in our life and go and have therapy and get a number of degrees and all sorts of things, our reptilian brain is still incredibly powerful. And we feel first and we think second. So I know there was discussion about, trusting our gut, but sometimes our gut, particularly if you've come from a background where that has been incongruent with your lived experience, can lead you astray. And it's our capacity to think about things, always checking and thinking about things. And we would all have that experience in this room of meeting with families where we have become highly distressed or anxious in the presence of that family. Yes? Situations where we stop thinking because our reptilian brain is saying danger. This is highly distressing, this is highly anxiety provoking. And that's the time in which we need to say, down, naughty crocodile, because we're Australians, not alligators, and think about why am I having such a profound feeling at this point in time? Why do I find this child in my group so much more difficult to connect to than all the other kids in the group? What's going on here? Being reflective. I knew it was coming, but when it did... Okay, so we need to be able to, I think, at the end of the day, think about how our client group, if we're talking about families that have come from severe and ongoing violence, and I'm not saying for everybody, but for many of the families that come into our services, operate very much from the lower order of the brain, and it's about survival. And that we can move and do the same thing as well when we work with them, where we just get into a state of, I'll just do whatever it is I have to do to help them, I get them the clothes, I do whatever, but I'm really not going to form a relationship with them because they're just too difficult. And then I think we can mirror going down here. And particularly kids that have come from very traumatic backgrounds that are very naughty and difficult to like can take us to that space really quickly. And it's how we manage to come back up to higher order thinking and be reflective about this with these kids so we don't just react. We've got school teachers in the room? Yeah? And I think school teachers can be incredible therapists to kids because we talked about yesterday, or is it in the car? We're talking about the third place, which you're going to talk about this afternoon. But I think that schools and childcare centres are often the third or the second family. They're the second family, and I think they can be incredibly reparative experiences for kids. And teachers that are able to see beyond this stuff and stay up here and think about kids usually can bring the best out in these kids and enable them to begin to have a different neural experience around being able to think about themselves and others as well. It's very profound for a kid that has someone in their school environment or somewhere anywhere that says, I remember it was your birthday last week, tell me how your birthday was. Or someone that says, so I've been thinking about you and I know you had a really bad day yesterday, how are you feeling today? For some kids that don't consider that they're kept in anyone's mind, you doing that can be incredibly powerful. So I won't go through all those. But I will say that. And that'll probably do. Yep.